So part 3, we'll be looking at the treatment of depression. Now, I'm sure you all have a pretty good idea already of what depression is, and whether or not we've suffered from any depression at any point in our lives, we're all familiar with sadness, negative emotions, guilt, feeling down. Depression is not those things. It is a disorder of mood that sits outside any of the normal limits of feeling bad. So the normal negative emotions that we all experience from time to time are not really what depression is. It's not normal sadness. So it is associated obviously with a lot of negative emotions. So somebody who's suffering from depression will suffer not just sadness but complete misery, black moods. It's true to say that it's probably best described as psychological pain. So people with major depressive illness do not suffer the kind of normal sadness that non-depressed people suffer. They suffer really terrible negative emotions, misery and pain. It's not just simply this deep misery, they also are pessimistic, they have feelings of hopelessness and despair. Very low self-esteem and very powerful feelings of guilt come along with major depressive illness. And sometimes also thought disorders. In other words, sometimes depression can come along with symptoms of psychosis, in other words, disorders of thought, sometimes even hallucinations, those kinds of things, depersonalization, certainly lack of motivation. People who are depressed often just don't want to do anything, just curl up in a little ball and lie there. So all of these things you see listed there come along with a diagnosis of depression. In addition to the emotional symptoms, there are often autonomic symptoms that we would associate perhaps more with anxiety, so the sweating and high heart rate, feeling of tightness and suffocation, often headaches. Psychomotor retardation is more common than acceleration, but what is meant by that is essentially a slowing down, not only of your mental functions but also of your physical functions. You don't want to do anything and you don't do anything. Often diurnal rhythm disturbances, in other words, your sleep-wake cycles are disturbed when you're more active, and when you're less active gets messed up, and therefore as a result very often your sleep patterns are messed up, and people who are depressed suffer more usually from insomnia, but sometimes from hypersomnia. In other words, a depressed person might sleep for many, many hours a day. That's also possible, but insomnia is more common. Along with loss of motivation, often loss of libido. A depressed person cannot get any positive emotions. Feelings of gratification or pleasure just don't happen, so there's a general despair. There are many different types of depressive disorder, and psychiatrists characterize them in various different ways. For example, at one time they used to characterize exogenous versus endogenous depression based on whether the depression seemed to have been triggered by some external event or whether it just seemed to happen. But there's less and less of that as there becomes a growing understanding that depression is produced, like most diseases, as a result of a combination of factors, and certainly there are factors that happen in life that could definitely worsen symptoms, could definitely impact on depression, but there are also very often endogenous factors, in other words, disorders with neurotransmission that are the basic underlying cause for depression in the first place, and they may well be impacted on by environmental factors and genetic factors, but they're all acting to produce the same kinds of effects. So I didn't think it was worth us looking into lots of different subtypes of depression, because it doesn't really help in the overall understanding of what the disorder is. It is true to say that depression is often also put into categories of unipolar versus bipolar. Bipolar disorder being the disorder where you have periods of depression interspersed with periods of mania. So the bipolar referring to that you swing between these two extremes of mood, being deep depression and the other extreme being mania. In other words, extreme agitation, excitation, busyness, an Energizer Bunny on speed at the mania end, and then deep depression at the other end. So that would be how bipolar disorder is characterized. And the time between cycles, of course, would vary widely between individuals. So some people might cycle between mania and depression quite frequently. Some people may only have one episode of mania in their entire life. They might have a very slow cycle and be mainly depressed. And then on the other hand, a person might be diagnosed with unipolar depression. In other words, they only get depressive episodes, they don't ever get the mania. But even those distinctions are being questioned. Is it truly a different disorder if you have symptoms of mania and depression, or are you just looking at the same thing on different cycle lengths? If someone who's depressed their whole life, is it just that they're taking a longer time to swing into mania? But since bipolar disorder is a big issue, we need to also look at how the mania side of bipolar disorder is treated. The symptoms of mania would be basically the extreme opposite to what you'd get during a depressive episode. So excessive euphoria, self-confidence. If you have bipolar disorder, you can swing to having no confidence in yourself, to thinking you're a complete failure, to feeling intensely guilty about how you've let everybody down. And then if you're having a manic period, you're incredibly confident about your abilities, you're really happy and up, and you have to do everything now. You have these huge grandiose ideas and huge plans about what you're going to do. There's no stopping you. There's no obstacle you can't overcome when you're in a manic episode. So very impulsive, very impatient, want to get everything done, extremely active all the time, speaking very rapidly, lots of plans, lots of schemes, all over the place. So those would be the symptoms of mania. Some people who have bipolar disorder actually find that the manic periods are the bits that make it worthwhile having the disorder. In other words, they enjoy the euphoria, as I guess you would, and the self-confidence and all of the extra energy that they have during the manic period, and they actually don't want those symptoms to be treated because that's the payback for having to suffer the depression. So some people with bipolar disorder say, no, I love my manic phases and I don't want them to be ironed out. But there are pharmacological treatments for mania as there are for the depressive periods. So to treat the depression, these are the major drug classes, and at the top, as usual, I put the most commonly used going down to the least commonly used at the bottom of the list. So at the top nowadays are the SSRIs, the specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The older classes of drugs are coming after the SSRIs, the TCAs, tricyclic antidepressants. These are not really acting differently from the specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but they're just less selective. They are older drugs, but they're essentially doing a similar thing. And after them, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the MAOIs, which are acting slightly differently, but they are essentially doing the same thing. And you remember when we talked about the transmitters, looking at all of these drugs together, they all act to raise the level of monoamine transmission in the brain in some way. The case of the SSRIs and the TCAs, they're doing that by blocking the active reuptake of monoamines back into the nerve terminals. In the case of the SSRIs, of course, you're blocking specifically the serotonin reuptake and not necessarily the noradrenaline dopamine reuptake, but with the TCAs you'd be blocking all of the reuptake. In the case of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you're blocking the breakdown of the neurotransmitter by blocking the enzyme which does that breakdown, monoamine oxidase. These two classes of drugs are older. They are not less effective than the newer drugs like SSRIs, but they have many more side effects which come along with their use, and therefore they are harder to take long term. Easier to take because the side effects are more tolerable are the SSRIs, and therefore they are more commonly used now. The tricyclics, and particularly the MAOIs, would only be taken by people who for some specific reason can't take the newer drugs.